Trajann being added as a buffer has already promised to shake up the raid meta, producing best in slot results when mixed in with the mech team and having future potential synergy with Trajann, the multi-hit team, and perhaps further Custodes character releases. At max level, as seen here, at max level his passive adds plus 1096 damage per hit and plus 2 hits to non-normal attacks when he is adjacent to a target. One might assume from this, therefore, that the Neurothrope raid team is one that would have no interest in this character. The Neurothrope does not add neuroparasite damage to its active ability, so increasing the hit count of that will make no difference. The team has a relatively low hit count, so despite being able to make full use of Trajann's damage buff thanks to their psychic damage and 100% pierce, its overall boost to damage output will still be relatively insignificant. Finally, due to the Neurothrope dealing its damage via normal attacks, increasing its hit count via Trajann's passive ability to gain 2 bonus applications, as actually seen in the passive description here. So to gain those 2 bonus applications of neuroparasite damage isn't possible. Or is it? The Neurothrope has the Psyker trait, which allows it to hit a random adjacent enemy to its primary target. This hit deals a base of 50% damage of a normal hit from the Psyker, and importantly does not count as a normal attack, meaning that it receives a plus 2 hit boost from Trajann's passive. I don't have a video of this pertaining to the Neurothrope team in raids, but I have a recording of Varro's Smite, the extra hit from his normal attack, gaining 2 additional hits from Trajann's passive when hitting a Scarab Swarm to prove that this works, which I'll play now. So if you just pay attention to the 2 Scarab Swarms closest to Varro, you'll see that the so he hit one and dealt 1 hit to it with his normal attack, and then the one that was hit by his smite, 3 members of that Scarab Swarm have died, which shows that it's been hit 3 times, proving that Trajann's passive does add the extra 2 hits to the smite of a Psyker. If this works for Varro, then it must also work for the Neurothrope, because they have the same trait. So the Neurothrope's neuroparasite damage is added to the Neurothrope's additional attacks, and despite the description of the attack being that it does 50% damage of a normal hit, this refers only to its base damage. It still gains full bonus damage from neuroparasite. So at 15 stacks of neuroparasite with the ability at max level, this equates to a bonus of 32,910 damage. Now if you multiply this by 3 hits, the Neurothrope is essentially dealing 100,000 damage per attack by its passive alone. That's not even taking into account its base damage or potential damage multipliers. In terms of damage multipliers, there are several that are relevant to the Neurothrope, and I'll list them out here in ascending order of size. So you can just take a look at that. Nothing too obscure there. I think anyone who's familiar with the Neurothrope team will know what these are. So of these, High Ground and Ahriman's passive are pretty much obligatory where they're available in a top tier Neuro team battle, and give a combined damage bonus of plus 100% damage to a Neurothrope's damage output. It would be nice to add those other multipliers to these, but just how feasible might that be? Roswitha seems like a risky choice to me. You're already compromising on your ability to build neuroparasite stacks rapidly by including Trajann on the team, and Roswitha's similar inability to build stacks may be one compromise too far. That is not an issue so much for Zybia, who deals psychic damage, so she is my preferred choice out of the 2 for a generic Trajann-centric neuro team when it comes to providing a 20% buff to damage. And also Zybia's ability has the advantage of being able to apply to any boss rather than Roswitha's just applying to demons. So now there is also the choice of Machine of War, and it's at this point I want to take a step back and consider just how you might be able to employ such a team against a boss. So just my kind of recommended team here. You've got Neurothrope, Ahriman and Trajann as your core characters, and then there's a bit of choice but not much. I think Zybia, Mephiston and Abraxas will all see uses with this team, but I can't really think of anything else that'd be too great. So this could be a positive, I guess. You don't have to build too many characters, but if for some reason any of these these characters don't end up working, then you don't really have any viable replacements, so that's a downside to this. Now, In terms of the viability of the team against the different bosses in guild raids, you can't use the Neurothrope against any Tyrannid bosses, and Magnus and Zarek are out of the question too. This leaves your viable targets as side bosses: Mortarion, the Rogel Dawn tank, the Avatar of Cain, Belisarius Kull, and Gazkul. Obviously, the need to have enemies adjacent to the boss that you're able to attack with the Neurothrope is mandatory to get those triple hits in via its smite, and this further narrows down the easy targets. Gazkul doesn't call in summon support until turn 4, and even if he does, even when he does, there's every chance that they'll get killed by their passive ability before being able to do anything, let alone consistently place themselves adjacent to Gazkul for your convenience. The Avatar of Cain may also be a tough nut to crack due to the absence of readily available high ground, combined with the evasiveness and potentially deadly disruptiveness of its adds and summons. Perhaps some mad genius will be able to make this team work against the Avatar, but it will likely be a Herculean task to do so, especially when also having to account for boss summon RNG. Still, Yazgor is a staple member of the Neurothrope team for his ability to add 1 stack of Neuroparasite per turn, and also to, more importantly, give the Neurothrope a grand total of 1 additional hit over the course of the battle. Even pulling off a single triple hit attack may be enough to bring Trajann on par with what Yazgor can offer, and further triggers of the triple hit will be a bonus, making this theoretically a team with higher skill and damage ceilings than ones that already exist. The only other boss fights I'll seriously consider for this team are Mortarion, Kull, and the Rogel Dawn tank. Now, it's all very well and good having the boss adds that you can exploit to splash damage from the Neurothrope over onto the boss, but you need to be able to keep those adds alive until such time as you use them for this vital purpose. What this translates to is needing to be very careful if and when you try to use Abraxas's ability. His summons don't care what your intricate plans may be and will happily ruin any chance you have of scoring big damage. And speaking of Thousand Sun Sorcerers, in order to get the bonus damage from Ahriman's passive, the boss needs to be on a Flaming Hex. You can't always rely on using Ahriman's ranged attack to achieve this, because the splash damage from it will kill adjacent boss adds and summons, and therefore potentially prevent you from using them to splash damage onto the boss with the Neurothrope's attacks. Ahriman and Abraxas deal fire damage in melee, and so meleeing a boss with them is a way to circumvent this problem. But anyway, back to Abraxas' summons causing the player grief. The Rogel Dawn has a built-in counter to this problem in that you can deliberately trigger its overwatch to kill whatever summons you've deployed by positioning Abraxas in front of it before using his active, and then after that moving characters into and out of its cone of fire. This is also a method for rapidly building Neuroparasite stacks, where you get all of Abraxas' summons killed, hit the boss with psychic damage so that he deploys more summons, get those summons killed, and rinse and repeat as much as you can to keep hitting the boss with Abraxas' Infernal Pact's passive to build up a lot of Neuroparasite stacks. So this may serve very well in general as a tactic against this boss, both in terms of getting you lots of those lovely stacks and ensuring that your summons don't cause you any trouble over the rest of the battle, because the boss's adds are extremely weak and they probably won't be able to survive the screamers or kill them quickly enough if you have your screamers leveled up significantly. So another thing that works in the player's favour is the lack of annoying boss summons over the course of the Rogel Dawn fight, and that means you can forgo using a Forge Fiend and use a Biovore to bait boss adds to exactly where you want them to be. Though if you can go without the Biovore, the Exorcist Machine of War, the New Sisters Machine of War, or the Forge Fiend would be preferable for either the bonus Neurothrope damage or easy activation of Ahriman's passive, which you can do with the fire from the Forge Fiend. Although the Exorcist also has abilities that involve dealing fire damage, so perhaps the Forge Fiend would actually be completely irrelevant here. Now, in terms of Kull, I have sort of labelled him as being impractical here because he's a very thorny target to tangle with. His leaving his adds alive gives him the chance to stack them with Machine Vengeance before then sucking it up and activating his Purge solution to wipe your entire team. Marshalling his adds in a way to exploit Trajan's additional hits, whilst also keeping Kull from wiping your team and also not having a Biovore to manipulate position of him/his adds due to the need to kill his summons with a Forge Fiend, sounds like a nightmare incarnate to me. Though at least Mephiston's passive will remove some degree of unpredictability from the actions of Kull's adds by preventing them from being able to heal him. Still, I don't think this will be feasible, especially given the need to keep his ads alive long enough to exploit them once Neuroparasite has reached maximum stacks. I'll analyse how much damage the Neurothrope could do to him in this team, but more out of interest than real practical consideration, I think. It bears repeating that you probably only need to pull off a couple of triple hits to outperform Yazagor with Trajann. Being able to get triple hits every possible turn would be nice, but it isn't necessary to still be an improvement over what already exists. So still might be a point in the favour of Trajann being viable here, but I think I'd rather use a traditional Abraxas Yazagor team if I was forced to choose between the two, just for the sake of Abraxas' summons being able to really easily handle the boss's ads. Whereas the team with Trajann, I think, lacks the hitting power to really handle them fast enough to stop you from being wiped out by a purge solution. So finally, in terms of the viable bosses that I've listed out, there's Mortarion, who I think shows the greatest potential as a target of this team. Now, by keeping the side boss Corrodius alive and unharmed, you can ensure that every organic unit on your team that is defeated is transformed into a Poxwalker, which will allow you to create Poxwalkers freely to then splash damage from onto Mortarion, using the Biovol's passive. Keeping Corrodius alive also means lower token expenditure on clearing side bosses, as well as giving a 100% chance for dying organic units to turn into Poxwalkers. Due to Mortarion's non-random behaviour, this will make any strategies you develop with this team 100% repeatable outside of any edge cases of RNG variation in Morty's damage output affecting outcomes. Say, his Reaping Scythe manages to kill a Psyker in one run, but it doesn't quite manage to kill them in another. However likely that may be, I don't know. So the downsides to keeping Corrodius alive are that Revoltingly Resilient will kick in after just 2 hits per attack, which reduces Trajann's damage bonus to the Neurothrope to plus 150% rather than plus 200%, and also that his extra movement may be detrimental to controlling him on some maps. However, I think that 100% repeatable strategies are worth the trade-off. All in all, in terms of what Machine of War to bring, I think that the Biovol will be mandatory against Mortarion and act as training wheels against other bosses. Advanced strategies may be able to be developed in time to direct boss ads and summons without the need for small mines, making the Exorcist available to give a 20% boost to the Neurothrope's damage, and this would ultimately be the best option. Now, all this being said, there's the unfortunate issue of the Neurothrope team just not being meta viable in many guild raid fights at all at present. So is there any chance that the inclusion of Trajann to the team will propel them into top dog position in any of the fights I've just covered? Circling back round to the Neurothrope's damage output, I'll quickly run through how much you can expect it to do with various combinations of buffs when dealing 3 hits to give roughly 100k damage per attack. So you have the plus 33% from Araman to give 133k damage, and then an extra 20% on top of that from the Exorcist gives 160k damage, an extra 20% on top of that from Zybia using her active, which lasts for 2 turns, will give you 190k damage, and finally an extra 50% from High Ground will give you a maximum possible bonus of 290k damage. So based on the team composition I'm thinking of, I think it is feasible for the Neurothrope to make at least 3 attacks with maxed Neuroparasite stacks in a standard raid battle, and a further attack with close to maxed stacks. I'll now run through what sort of damage might be expected from Neuroparasite per hit boosted Neurothrope attack for each potentially viable target boss when you are at the maxed stacks for Neuroparasite. So for Rogel Dawn, you can see total for those 3 turns will be 540k damage from Neuroparasite, Mortarion 565k damage, Avatar 540k damage, and for Cool 680k damage. Although again, despite how nice that might look on Cool, I think the practicalities of that make that unachievable in reality. So looking at these numbers, they may not look all that impressive to anyone who doesn't have experience with Legendary 4 or Legendary 5 raid bosses, but the fact that the Neurothrope is dealing 100% pierce with its attacks makes this look competitive with the current top raid teams against the highest level iterations of all these bosses, just because the multi-hit team and the AdMech team are so heavily affected by boss armor. And given the likely best case scenarios I've laid out here, I think, this team definitely does have some potential viability. So some rough benchmarks for the current top tier damage output against these bosses are, as far as I'm aware, now take this with a grain of salt because I'm just a guy in a guild that isn't part of, the top dogs, so this is just my kind of second-hand viewing of this information. But yeah, for Legendary 3 Rogal Dawn, it's about 700k damage maybe maximum. Legendary 5 Mortarion, it goes over 600,000, so maybe 600 to 650k. Legendary 5 Avatar, maybe 500k, and Legendary 5 Cool, 700 to 750k. That damage for Cool has an asterisk because it was done using a forecast-centered team on a map that was very conducive to hitting the boss in melee from high ground. Other Cool maps with more scant high ground may favour the Neurothrope a bit more, because the Neurothrope is much more capable of exploiting high ground due to its high range in comparison to a melee character. And I have to bear in mind also that these values that I've given are map dependent as well. So if you bear in mind too that I've neglected to consider high ground being an option in fights against the tank and the avatar, and only looked at the damage of the Neurothrope in the final 3 turns, not including the damage of any of its teammates, and ignoring the fact that even a mere 10 stacks of Neuroparasite in turn 3 will give the Neurothrope an unmodified damage output of around 25k damage for a direct attack, and you'll come to realise that these damage values I've given for the Neuroparasite, whilst they will make up the bulk of your damage, there's still quite a lot more to be added to that over the course of an entire battle. Now, I mentioned a direct attack in the 3rd turn here because it's not a given that you'll be able to set off Trajan's passive more than 3 times per fight in a way that can then be exploited by the Neurothrope. So here I'll just give an order of active uses that I think will probably be about optimal. So in the 1st turn you usually can't expect to do anything to the boss, so you don't want to use any active abilities there. In the 2nd turn, you'll want to use the Neurothrope's active ability because it adds 2 stacks of Neuroparasite. In the 3rd turn, you'll want to use either Abraxas or Mephiston, depending on which one you have. Then after that, it's kind of a toss-up between Ahriman, Zybier and Trajann. Trajann, depending on how much damage he's taken so far, may need to heal at some point, so that will factor into when you decide to use his active ability. And Zybier, obviously you don't want to be using her active in the final turn because then you'll only benefit from its bonus damage for a single turn rather than 2 turns. So it's quite up in the air, the order, in a way, but there's also some definite things that you'll want to, definite abilities that you want to use at certain times. You may want to use the active of Abraxas earlier in the Rogal Dawn fight to make use of its overwatching clearing out his summons, depending on the map, but theoretically, scoring 3 hits of Neuroparasite per turn is possible for 4 turns in total in most fights. Now, with all of this in mind, do I recommend building this team? If you already have a Neurothrope team built, the level of investment required may not actually be very significant at all. The lion's share of damage that Trajann will be adding will not be via his passive damage boost, so you only need to level it to level 27 to reach close to its maximum potential. That's the point at which it grants 2 extra hits, I believe. Obviously, Trajann needs to survive an entire battle whilst being on hand to stand in melee with the boss to provide his bonus hits, so leveling him high will be mandatory for these fights, for the fights that this team shines brightest in, i.e. Fights against high-level bosses that will be probably spanking him around quite a bit. It will also be necessary to upgrade his active for the sake of its healing if bringing him to a fight against Morty due to Morty's contamination aura. At level 50, his active can heal him for 6,000 health, so this will come in very handy, I'm sure. In terms of the meta viability of this team, it's obvious I've added a lot of caveats and yeah buts over the course of this script, because it will probably take a long time to sound out strategies for a raid team that is as niche and radically different to pre-existing teams as this one. I'm especially deficient in this regard given that I haven't used a Neurothrope team in almost 18 months. Strategies with AdMech raid teams have taken months to develop bit by bit despite the rampant popularity of the team, and I wouldn't expect this team to fare any better in that regard, quite the opposite in fact. Even if someone does manage to figure out good strategies with it, there's no guarantee that any of that information will filter down to you anytime soon, so you'll need to be prepared to figure out stuff for yourself if you want to do well with this team, all without knowing if there'll be a decent payoff, at least until its level of viability becomes common knowledge. Another aspect of this team that may be that it could be preferable to keep side bosses alive in order to keep as many ads on the battlefield as possible. For most teams, reducing ads on the field is always a positive, and this cuts down on the experimentation needed to come up with optimal strategies. So this may further increase the time taken to find what's best for a Trajann Neurothrope crew. Not needing to kill side bosses is a potential benefit to token efficiency over the course of the raid season, but this is a double-edged sword as it may set your priorities against those of the rest of your guild, especially those members who may benefit from killing side bosses where you will suffer. Without good coordination with the rest of your guild, or enough people using a Trajann Neurothrope team to not need any help from your guildmates to quickly kill a boss, you may struggle to be able to carry out your attacks at a time that is best suited to your needs rather than those of everyone else. With all this in mind, I can't really recommend this team to anyone who is not extremely capable of strategizing for themselves and does not have a guild that is able to work with them both in terms of coordination and willingness to tolerate teething troubles you may have early on. This is not to diminish its potential power in theory, but I reckon that, more than for any other standard raid team, the practicalities of using this one will be bad, so proceed with caution. There is also the ultimate question of whether this interaction of the Neurothrope Smite attack gaining extra hits was intended. I kind of doubt it, and if not, whether it will be patched out of the game at a later date. My hopes would be no, as it is already quite limited in scope and not significant enough to destroy the current raid meta in the slightest, but you never know of these things, so yeah, watch out for that. And I think that's all I have to say here.